Welcome back to another deep dive. And, whether you are prepping for a massive meeting or trying to catch up on the cultural zeitgeist, or honestly, if you're just insanely curious, this one is designed specifically for you.
Absolutely.
And we are starting today with a number that frankly broke my brain a little bit.
Yeah.
So in the winter of 2022, Netflix released that dramatized series about the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, right. The Ryan Murphy one.
Yeah, that exact one. And in just 2 weeks, that single show accumulated 496 million hours watched globally.
I mean, to put that figure into perspective for you, you are looking at roughly 56,000 years of continuous human attention. And that's a completely voluntarily dedicated to watching the methodical destruction of human lives.
It's wild.
It is. It became the second most popular show in the platform's history almost overnight.
And it isn't just big budget television driving this, right? If you look at the audio landscape, like on the podcast directory, Podchaser right now, there are over 23,000 true crime shows.
Wait, shows, not episodes.
Shows, not episodes. Entire shows dedicated to murder, cold cases, and sheer human tragedy.
That is just staggering.
Right. So, the mission for our deep dive today, pulling from this massive stack of sources we have across evolutionary psychology, criminology, and, media studies, is to decode a very specific mystery. We are figuring out why you and millions of other perfectly normal, functioning members of society voluntarily spend your leisure time at 2 a.m. immersing yourselves in the absolute darkest corners of human behavior.
Yeah, and to understand that obsession, we kind of have to bypass modern society entirely. We need to travel back in time to look at the hardwiring of the ancient human brain.
Because evolution is fundamentally a biological engine built for one thing, right? Self-preservation.
Exactly. It insists on keeping us alive to pass on our genes. So the paradox we have to unravel is why a biological mechanism designed strictly for survival would allow us, let alone strongly encourage us, to seek out these horrifying scenarios.
That is the core contradiction. I mean, if our brains want to keep us safe, we should be biologically rigged to just run away from stories about predators, not binge an entire 10-hour season of them on a Sunday afternoon.
You would think so. But Dr. Colton Scrivener, he's a behavioral scientist who studies morbid curiosity.
Yeah.
He argues that this behavior isn't a character flaw. It certainly isn't a sign that you, as a listener, are psychologically disturbed.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. He says it is actually a highly sophisticated evolutionary survival tool. He points to a psychological concept known as prepared learning.
Prepared learning?
Yeah. So the human brain is heavily optimized to learn associations related to threats much faster than it learns neutral or positive information.
Okay, let's unpack this. If true crime is basically a flight simulator for the brain letting us crash without actually getting hurt, are we actually learning anything useful or just terrifying ourselves?
That's a great analogy.
Because, sitting on the couch, listening to a horrific story isn't exactly the same as outrunning a saber-toothed tiger. How does hearing about a crime happening to someone else activate that ancient survival hardware?
What's fascinating here is the mechanism of the brain's fear processing center, the amygdala.
Right, the lizard brain.
Exactly. The amygdala operates on something called the negativity bias. In the ancestral environment, if you failed to notice a pleasant opportunity, say like a bush full of berries, you just missed a snack, you'd be hungry, but you would survive.
But if you miss the tiger?
Exactly. Failing to notice a threat, like a predator hiding in the brush, was instantly fatal. So the brain prioritizes threat intelligence above almost everything else. True crime kind of hacks this system by offering what psychotherapist Kathleen Check calls a psychological protective barrier.
Oh, meaning we get to study the threat without actually being in the room with it.
Precisely. You are running mental threat simulations from a completely safe distance.
That makes so much sense.
Right. Your conscious brain knows you are on the couch, but your subconscious is actively building a mental database. It is taking very detailed notes on how dangerous people operate, how they manipulate their environment, what specific verbal traps they use, and what warning signs precede violence.
So you are essentially downloading the enemy's playbook, gathering intelligence so your brain can say, well, if I know how predators operate, I can spot them before they strike.
That's it, exactly.
That flips the script completely. It turns a morbid hobby into active risk management. But if this is a universal human survival tool hardwired into all of us, we have to look at the demographics of who is actually consuming this content, because the audience heavily skews toward one specific group.
It really does. The gender divide in this space is just staggering. Looking at the global metrics, 75% of all true crime podcast listeners are women.
75%.
Yeah. And criminologist Scott Bond, who actually tours live shows analyzing serial killers, has tracked his own audiences over the years. He notes they're consistently 80% or more female.
Which brings up a very sobering reality about why women might feel a much stronger biological imperative to study the enemy's playbook.
It directly informs a theory called the protective vigilance hypothesis. The underlying logic there rests on the vastly different types of threats men and women have historically faced.
Okay, how so?
Well, Dr. Scrivener points out that men historically face violence from strangers or rival groups. Consequently, male gravitation leans heavily toward combat simulations. You see this in the massive male audiences for, like, UFC, military history, or action movies.
Right, preparing for a physical confrontation.
Exactly. Women, however, face threats primarily from people they know, often in spaces where they're supposed to be completely safe.
And the research data backs this up in a pretty dark way. In the U.S. alone, 1 in 5 women will experience attempted or completed rape.
It's awful.
It really is. And 81% will experience sexual harassment or assault. So the threats depicted in true crime, the charming stranger offering help, the trusted partner who slowly isolates their spouse, the co-worker who crosses boundaries, these are not abstract, hypothetical fantasies for female listeners. They are highly plausible, everyday realities.
And because of that, risk management for women requires a highly complex exercise in empathy, which is a mechanism true crime activates brilliantly.
Empathy? How does empathy fit into learning about a killer?
Well, the psychological studies show that women uniquely identify with the victim in these narratives. They mentally map the victim's choices onto their own lives. But crucially, they also engage in cognitive empathy with the perpetrators.
Really? With the perpetrators?
Yes, but they aren't doing this to excuse the violence at all. They are trying to reverse engineer the manipulator's mindset. They want to decode the underlying psychology so they can identify those exact behavioral red flags in their own romantic or professional lives.
Mm-hmm. Here's where it gets really interesting. Are we giving ourselves a little too much credit here?
What do you mean?
I mean, claiming this is an elite evolutionary hypervigilance tactic feels like a very convenient justification. Let's be real, a lot of people just want to be entertained. We can't definitively say every single person tuning into a gruesome unsolved mystery is doing it purely for biological risk management.
That is a completely fair pushback. And Scott Bond actually addresses that exact tension. He coined a perfect term for it: popcorn entertainment.
Popcorn entertainment?
Yeah, the genre isn't entirely a clinical exercise in survival. It is multifaceted. Yes, it functions as a survival rehearsal and an empathy-building tool, but at its core, much of it is just unapologetic escapism.
Right, like a roller coaster.
Precisely. Bond poses a very direct question. Dynamically, how different is watching a dramatized Jeffrey Dahmer series from watching a fictional horror movie franchise like Saw?
Probably not that different for a lot of people.
Exactly. For a massive segment of the audience, the draw is the visceral thrill of a well-told story, the suspense, and, the adrenaline spike of the macabre.
So that cocktail of ancient survival instinct mixed with pure popcorn entertainment has created an absolute juggernaut. We aren't just talking about a popular genre anymore. We are talking about a massive global economy. I saw projections placing the podcast market value at roughly $39.63 billion in 2025.
That is a staggering amount of money.
And true crime is arguably the primary engine driving that audio boom?
The economic scale is immense, for sure. But the internal analytics of who makes up this lucrative market are highly unexpected. The audience profile contradicts the stereotype of, the basement-dwelling weirdo obsessed with gore.
Right.
The data actually shows that the people most heavily invested in this genre tend to be highly educated, high-earning professionals.
The occupational breakdown blew my mind. When you look at the top listeners, you see a huge concentration of managers, authors, and specifically nurses.
Nurses make perfect sense when you think about the clinical interest in anatomy and trauma.
Totally. And then you look at the top corporate employers of true crime audiences, and the list includes Walt Disney, Target, and the U.S. Army.
U.S. Army.
Yes. You literally have soldiers and Disney employees bonding over the exact same cold cases at the water cooler.
That is wild. It reveals how pervasively the genre penetrates everyday professional life. And it is entirely a global phenomenon, too, though it manifests with some bizarre cultural quirks depending on the region.
Like what?
Well, in Canada, nearly 23% of all top charting podcasts are true crime. And Spain recently recorded a 408% year-over-year increase in listening hours in this exact category.
Wow. But you know, the global oddity that completely stopped me in my tracks was the data out of Germany.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
49% of German true crime consumers reported that their primary time for listening to stories of brutal, unresolved murder is at night to relax.
It sounds so counterintuitive.
It's like listening to a digital lullaby of doom. How on earth does the brain hear a detailed breakdown of a home invasion and decide to power down and go to sleep?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires looking at the mechanics of the nervous system and how narratives actually influence neurochemistry.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about the rigid, almost soothing, ritualistic nature of the true crime format. These stories almost always follow a highly predictable arc. A chaotic crime disrupts society. A meticulous investigation unfolds to make sense of the chaos. And in most cases, the perpetrator is apprehended.
So it's the resolution that triggers the relaxation, not the violence itself.
Exactly. The narrative takes the listener through a spike in cortisol during the telling of the crime. But the apprehension of the killer provides a massive psychological release. It restores a sense of moral order to the universe.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, the fact that the danger is safely contained within a pair of headphones provides a deep subconscious sense of control. You are safely in your bed, experiencing the absolute worst chaos human nature has to offer, but you have the power to simply hit pause if it gets too intense. That control actually downregulates the nervous system.
So what does this all mean when we take these millions of highly engaged, educated listeners who are seeking order out of chaos and put them together? What we've seen recently is this audience realizing they have collective power.
They absolutely do.
They are taking this obsession out of their headphones and actively leveraging it to influence real-world courtrooms and law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, academics refer to this modern shift as the new true crime. For decades, the genre operated under the assumption that whoever the police arrested was guilty, and the content merely focused on the gruesome details of the act itself.
Right, the old tabloid style.
Exactly. But the paradigm shifted massively around 2014, which is largely credited to the cultural phenomena of the podcast Serial.
Oh, of course. Serial changed everything.
It really did. The focus pivoted away from just rubbernecking at violence to actively interrogating systemic failures, exposing prosecutorial misconduct, and shining a light on wrongful convictions.
And the mechanics of how this works in the real world are incredible. You effectively have a decentralized intelligence agency made of hundreds of thousands of listeners.
Civilian army.
Literally. When a show highlights an inconsistency, you suddenly have civilians filing Freedom of Information Act requests, tracking down forgotten witnesses, and uncovering alibis that overworked local detectives simply missed.
And it generates tangible legal results, too. Take the Menendez brothers, for example.
Oh, that's a huge one right now.
In 2024, after spending decades in prison, they received a resentencing recommendation. That legal maneuver was driven almost entirely by the crushing public pressure generated by recent documentaries and docudramas.
It's powerful.
And in Canada, journalist David Ridgen hosts a CBC podcast that doesn't just discuss cold cases. The listener tips generated by his investigations have literally reopened cases, resulting in actual police indictments and arrests.
It is completely altering the dynamic inside the courtroom, too. Criminal litigator Danielle Rapason noted that judges and juries have developed what she calls a healthy skepticism toward police testimony.
Which is a big shift from a few decades ago.
Massive. Historically, juries took the word of law enforcement as gospel. Today, because they've listened to hundreds of hours of content exposing botched investigations, juries aggressively demand to know if the authorities have genuinely done their due diligence.
While that sounds like a victory for accountability, it introduces a severe tension that legal experts are really wrestling with.
Oh, like what?
Well, criminal defense attorney Adam Banner issued a profound warning about this shift. He acknowledges that it is a beautiful thing when media pressure exposes a flaw and frees an innocent person.
Yeah.
However, true crime, by definition, hyper-focuses on outlier situations.
Meaning the most bizarre, unresolved, shocking, and convoluted cases.
Exactly.
Because, nobody is going to listen to a 10-part deep dive about a straightforward convenience store robbery where the guy is caught on camera and immediately confesses.
Exactly. That's boring television. But when the media solely holds these highly exceptional, convoluted cases up to the light, it creates a deeply distorted public perception of the justice system.
I could see that.
It creates a sort of conspiracy mindset among the public. Juries begin to expect hidden motives, planted evidence, and massive cover-ups in standard trials. It damages the credibility of a legal system where, statistically speaking, the vast majority of convictions are factually correct and procedurally sound.
And this distortion doesn't just impact abstract legal institutions either. We have to look at the massive collateral damage inflicted on the actual human beings at the center of these tragedies. Because as much as we celebrate the investigative triumphs, there is an incredibly dark ethical underbelly to this womb.
There is. And the most glaring ethical failure in the industry right now is the issue of consent.
This part is so tough to talk about.
It is. When Netflix released the Dahmer series to massive success, Rita Isbell, whose brother Errol Lindsay was murdered by Dahmer, spoke out publicly. She revealed she was completely blindsided by the show.
No warning at all.
None. No one from the production contacted her. They didn't ask her permission. They simply recreated her emotional victim impact statement word for word, turning her family's agonizing trauma into content.
Most people assume that if a massive studio is making millions of dollars dramatizing your specific life tragedy, they would legally have to get you to sign a release form or, offer compensation.
They assume that, but it all comes down to a massive legal loophole. Court documents, trial transcripts, and police reports are public records. Studios have zero legal obligation to ask families for permission.
That is insane.
As long as the creators portray the facts established in the public record accurately, mostly to avoid defamation lawsuits, they can legally turn anyone's worst nightmare into a multi-million-dollar entertainment property. The family has absolutely no say in how their trauma is commodified.
That is just brutal, and it speaks directly to the research conducted by Kelly Bowling on what she categorizes as co-victims.
Low victims.
Yeah, the friends, families, and communities left behind by the actual victims. Bowling's work highlights the profound re-traumatization these productions cause. The families lose their privacy all over again, sometimes decades after they thought they had finally found closure.
I can't even imagine.
But the most alarming finding in her research is the direct harassment these families face from the audience itself.
Yes, and that is a dark consequence of the crowdsourced investigation model we discussed earlier. Consuming hundreds of hours of true crime gives some fans this illusion of expertise.
Oh, absolutely.
You end up with overzealous amateur sleuths trying to solve closed cases themselves. They will track down and harass the victims' families on social media, demanding information or pushing completely unhinged theories, genuinely believing they have some innate detective ability that the professionals missed.
That illusion of expertise is bad enough, but there is a psychological phenomenon in this fandom that is even harder to comprehend. It's the concept of hybristophilia, which is sometimes colloquially called Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. This is the documented phenomenon where people develop genuine romantic or sexual attractions to highly violent criminals.
It is arguably one of the most perplexing psychological miswirings associated with the genre. High-profile serial killers like Richard Ramirez and Ted Bundy famously received sacks of love letters, marriage proposals, and gifts from legions of fans while sitting on death row.
But what is the mechanism behind that? I mean, how does the brain bypass the intense evolutionary fear we talked about earlier and convert a literal apex predator into a romantic interest?
Psychologists suggest it operates on a couple of different tracks. For some, it is driven by a profound savior complex. It's the delusion that their love alone is powerful enough to tame the ultimate beast, which provides a massive ego boost.
Right, the I can fix him mentality taken to the absolute extreme.
Exactly. For others, it's an evolutionary misfiring. Deep in the primal brain, highly aggressive, dominant traits can be misinterpreted as indicators of strength and protection. They are attracted to the ultimate alpha danger. But because the killer is locked behind bars, the fan gets to experience proximity to that extreme danger without any of the actual somatic risk.
Wow. So we are sitting here analyzing how true crime is this sophisticated survival tool, while simultaneously families are being aggressively harassed by amateur internet detectives and convicted killers are getting fan mail. Is the concept of ethical true crime just a comforting oxymoron we use to justify our morbid curiosity?
This raises an important question for the future of the medium. Can this actually be done without exploiting the victims? Researcher Sophie Ball conducted a comparative study to map out exactly where the ethical boundaries lie.
What did she find?
She compared the Dahmer series, which heavily prioritized the killer's perspective and bypassed family consent entirely, with another British true crime series called Until I Kill You.
And what was the procedural difference in how they handled the narrative?
The defining difference was active inclusion. Until I Kill You actively involved the real-life survivor, Delia Balmer, in the production process.
Right.
They didn't just extract her story from public records. They gave her agency, over how her trauma was depicted.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. Bowles' conclusion is that dramatizing crime is not inherently exploitative. If creators are willing to prioritize survivor dignity over mere spectacle, if they just stop to ask, what does telling this story cost the people who actually lived it, then ethical storytelling is entirely achievable.
And it is worth noting that the vast majority of listeners aren't engaging in those extreme behaviors we talked about. Psychologist Emma Kenny points out that most consumers truly just want the moral resolution. They want the psychological relief of seeing bad people locked away, reinforcing the idea that society is ultimately safe.
Yeah, the desire for justice is a huge driver.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to speak directly to you listening right now. The next time you find yourself 3 episodes deep into a cold case mystery at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, do not feel like you are broken or weird or somehow overly morbid. Your fascination is a deeply human, ancient survival mechanism firing exactly as it was designed to.
Precisely.
It is your brain actively trying to protect you, wrapped in a profound sense of empathy and a desire for moral order. The solution isn't to stop listening, watching, or reading. The solution is to demand better from the creators making the content. We have to demand more responsible, survivor-centered stories that respect the real lives forever altered by these events.
It ultimately comes down to consuming media with intentional awareness. Once you understand the complex biological and psychological reasons why your brain craves this dark information, you gain the power to consciously choose how you engage with it moving forward.
But before you go, I want to leave you with one final, brand new thought to mull over on your own. We have established that true crime acts as our evolutionary flight simulator. It helps the general public recognize predators, decode their manipulation tactics, and build our psychological defenses.
Right.
But what happens to the predators themselves? Are the actual criminals out there tuning into these exact same true crime deep dives? Are they studying the genre to learn our defense mechanisms, identifying the mistakes past killers made, and reverse engineering the content to figure out how to better evade detection the next time?
Oh, wow. Now that is a truly terrifying simulation to run.
Something to think about the next time you plug your headphones in at 2 a.m. Thank you so much for taking the plunge into this deep dive with us. We will see you next time.